Whereas President Barack Obama spoke frequently about how the arc of the moral universe would ultimately bend toward justice. And for his part, President Ronald Reagan, who spoke of an America as a shining city on the hill, often said this, quote, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction." Donald J. Trump has taken to claiming on a near daily basis that a cadre of career public servants who worked toward justice and protected the rule of law under Democratic and Republican presidents and administrations should be jailed. Trump lashing out repeatedly at special counsel Jack Smith while traveling abroad, as well as other Department of Justice and FBI officials and leaders of watchdog groups in unhinged social media rants. Some of them posted very late at night / very early in the morning with a tone barely worthy of a Facebook.
Okay, so here's something that just happened, and it's absolutely massive. Like, this could be one of the most significant Supreme Court decisions in modern American history. Picture this. The Supreme Court, including justices that Trump himself appointed, just handed down a ruling that completely devastates his administration's use of executive power. We're talking about striking down his emergency tariff authority. We're talking about invalidating major trade policies that were central to his economic agenda. We're talking about ordering $88 billion in refunds, the largest financial sanction ever imposed on a presidential administration by the Supreme Court. And we're talking about establishing constitutional limits on presidential power that will affect every future president, Republican or Democrat, for generations to come. This isn't just a loss for Trump. This is the Supreme Court telling the executive branch that there are hard limits to your authority, and when you cross those lines, we will strike you down. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Everything. If you're trying to bypass Congress and act unilaterally, courts are going to scrutinize whether you have actual constitutional authority. The $88 billion refund requirement is absolutely staggering. That's not a symbolic sanction. That's a massive financial blow to the federal government and to Trump's administration. Businesses and consumers who paid these tariffs are going to get their money back, and the government has to figure out how to come up with that money. That's going to blow a huge hole in the federal budget. It's going to create administrative chaos as agencies figure out how to process refunds. And it's going to be a constant reminder that Trump's signature economic policies were ruled unconstitutional by the highest court in the land. Now, come on. Think about the political implications of this for a second. Trump has built his entire political brand on being a strong leader who gets things done without waiting for Congress, who uses executive power boldly, who doesn't let legal niceties get in.
This ruling came down on November 12, 2025, and the shockwaves are still reverberating through Washington. The Supreme Court looked at Trump's emergency tariff powers, the ones he's used to justify massive trade restrictions and economic policies, and said, no, these are unconstitutional. You exceeded your authority. The Constitution doesn't give presidents limitless executive power to bypass Congress and remake economic policy unilaterally. And this wasn't a close decision. This wasn't a 5-4 split along partisan lines. Justices from both conservative and liberal wings joined together in deep skepticism of Trump's approach to presidential power. That tells you something. When even the justices Trump appointed are ruling against him on fundamental questions of executive authority, you know the legal arguments weren't close. And honestly, can you believe this? This is where we are right now. The Supreme Court just told a sitting president that his core economic policy is unconstitutional, that his use of emergency powers violated the separation of powers, that he has to refund $88 billion to consumers and businesses, and that every future president is now constrained by the precedent this ruling establishes. This isn't just about tariffs. This is about the fundamental balance of power between the executive branch and Congress. This is about whether presidents can declare emergencies and do whatever they want, or whether there are constitutional limits that courts will enforce. Now, here's why this matters. Because this isn't just a legal ruling. This is a complete repudiation of Trump's approach to executive power. His entire strategy has been to use emergency declarations and executive authority to bypass Congress and implement policies unilaterally, immigration restrictions, trade tariffs, funding reallocations, all based on claiming emergency powers or stretching executive authority to its absolute limits. But the Supreme Court just said that approach is unconstitutional, that presidents must work with Congress, that separation of powers means something, that there are boundaries you cannot cross no matter how popular your policies are with your base. And the Supreme Court's language, Yeah, that's what makes it so devastating. They explicitly warned about dangerous precedent if executive and emergency powers go unchecked. They talked about constitutional separation of powers as a fundamental principle that protects democracy. They made clear this isn't just about tariffs or trade policy. This is about establishing limits that apply to all presidential actions across all policy areas: immigration, national security, economic regulation, everything. If you're trying to bypass Congress and act unilaterally, courts are going to scrutinize whether you have actual constitutional authority. The $88 billion refund requirement is absolutely staggering. That's not a symbolic sanction. That's a massive financial blow to the federal government and to Trump's administration. Businesses and consumers who pay these tariffs are going to get their money back, and the government has to figure out how to come up with that money. That's going to blow a huge hole in the federal budget. It's going to create administrative chaos as agencies figure out how to process refunds, and it's going to be a constant reminder that Trump's signature economic policies were ruled unconstitutional by the highest court in the land. Now, come on, think about the political implications of this for a second. Trump has built his entire political brand on being a strong leader who gets things done without waiting for Congress, who uses executive power boldly, who doesn't let legal niceties get in the way of implementing his agenda. But the Supreme Court just told him and his supporters that approach is unconstitutional. That strong leadership doesn't mean ignoring the Constitution, that you can't just declare emergencies and remake policy however you want. And that ruling comes from a Supreme Court that includes 3 justices he personally appointed. That's not deep state resistance. That's the highest judicial authority in America saying you violated the Constitution. And maybe, just maybe, this is the moment when the guardrails actually hold. Maybe this is when the constitutional system of checks and balances proves it can constrain even a popular president with a loyal base. Because if the Supreme Court is willing to strike down Trump's core economic policies and impose massive financial sanctions, that sends a message to every president. There are limits. Courts will enforce them. And if you cross constitutional boundaries, you will face consequences that can't be appealed or ignored. So yeah, this is where we are. This is the state of executive power in America in November 2025. The Supreme Court striking down presidential emergency authority, ordering unprecedented financial sanctions, establishing constitutional limits that will affect all future presidents, and forcing Republicans to confront the reality that their approach to executive power has been rejected by the judicial branch. And trust me, this story goes way deeper than one Supreme Court ruling, way deeper, because the precedent this establishes will shape presidential power and congressional authority for decades. And look, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking courts have ruled against presidents before and they just ignore it or work around it. But this is different. This is the Supreme Court. This is final. This is the end of the line legally, and Trump has to comply whether he wants to or not. All right, so let's talk about what's really happening here. Because most people are looking at this story and thinking it's just another court case about tariffs, just another legal ruling that'll get lost in the news cycle. But that's not what this is, not even close. This is the Supreme Court fundamentally redefining the limits of presidential power, and the implications go way beyond trade policy. This affects everything presidents try to do through executive authority rather than congressional legislation. Here's what most people don't understand about the significance of this ruling. The Supreme Court didn't just say Trump's specific tariffs were problematic. They ruled that his entire approach to emergency powers and executive authority was unconstitutional. That's a massive difference. A narrow ruling would have said these particular tariffs were imposed incorrectly, but the president has authority to do tariffs differently. But instead, the court said the constitutional principle of separation of powers means presidents can't bypass Congress to remake economic policy. That's a broad holding that applies to every future attempt to use emergency powers unilaterally. And are you kidding me? This is the Supreme Court telling presidents you are not kings. You cannot rule by decree. You have to work with Congress because that's what the Constitution requires. And they're doing this in a case involving Trump's signature policy issue during his second term, with consequences that will define his presidential legacy. That takes courage from the justices because they knew this ruling would be politically explosive. They knew Republicans would attack them. They knew Trump would denounce the decision, but they did it anyway because the constitutional principle mattered more than political considerations. The fact that conservative justices joined this decision is particularly significant because these are justices who generally favor strong executive power, who tend to defer to presidential authority, especially on national security and economic issues. But even they looked at Trump's emergency tariff authority and said this goes too far. This violates fundamental separation of powers principles. And when conservative and liberal justices agree on constitutional limits, that tells you the legal case is clear, that this isn't about politics or ideology. This is about what the Constitution actually allows. But here's where it gets really interesting. because the Supreme Court's reasoning applies to way more than tariffs. They talked about emergency powers generally, about the need for congressional authorization, about the dangers of unchecked executive authority. And all of that reasoning can be applied to other areas where Trump and future presidents try to act unilaterally: immigration policies, military deployments, regulatory changes. Anything where a president claims emergency authority or stretches executive power beyond clear statutory authorization is now vulnerable to challenge based on this precedent. So, when the Supreme Court issued this ruling on November 12, 2025, they weren't just deciding a tariff case, they were establishing constitutional boundaries that will constrain presidential power across the board, and that's either a restoration of proper checks and balances or a dangerous limitation on presidential flexibility, depending on your perspective. If you think presidents have been accumulating too much power and acting too unilaterally, this is a critical correction. If you think presidents need flexibility to respond to crises without waiting for Congress, this is a problematic restriction. The $88 billion refund requirement is particularly important because it creates real consequences for constitutional violations. Presidents might ignore court rulings if there's no practical impact, but when the Supreme Court orders you to refund $88 billion, you can't just ignore that. Businesses and consumers will demand their money, states will enforce the refund requirements, the administrative machinery will have to process the payments, and the budget impact will be impossible to hide. That's the court using its authority to ensure compliance with constitutional limits. And this is what people need to understand. The Supreme Court doesn't have an army. It can't physically force the president to comply with its rulings. It relies on institutional respect and practical consequences. And by imposing such a massive financial sanction, the court made non-compliance politically and practically impossible. Trump would have to explain why he's refusing to refund $88 billion to American businesses and consumers. That's not a sustainable position politically. The oral arguments leading up to this decision apparently featured justices from across the ideological spectrum expressing skepticism about Trump's position. They pressed government lawyers on how the emergency authority could be limited if Trump's interpretation was correct. They questioned whether Congress had actually authorized what Trump was doing. They expressed concern about setting precedent that future presidents could exploit, and all of that skepticism translated into a decisive ruling against the administration. The decision text itself is reportedly quite strong in its criticism of Trump's approach. References to bypassing congressional authority, warnings about dangerous precedent, emphasis on constitutional separation of powers as a fundamental safeguard. The justices weren't subtle. They wanted to make clear this ruling establishes firm boundaries that all presidents must respect. That's the court acting as a check on executive power, exactly the way the constitutional system is supposed to work. But here's what makes this moment so critical. This ruling comes as Trump is serving his second term and trying to implement his full agenda. It comes as Republicans control significant government power and are trying to reshape policy across multiple areas. And it comes from a Supreme Court that includes 3 Trump appointees and has a conservative majority. None of those factors saved Trump's emergency tariff authority from being struck down. That tells you the constitutional problems were severe enough that even friendly justices couldn't overlook them. The implications for other pending cases are enormous because there are challenges to presidential power across multiple policy areas currently in the courts: immigration restrictions, funding reallocations, emergency declarations, nationwide injunctions. And now all of those cases have to be decided in light of this precedent establishing that presidents can't bypass Congress and act unilaterally beyond clear constitutional authority. Some of those other policies might survive because they have better statutory authorization or fit more clearly within executive powers, but many of them are now at serious risk of being struck down based on this ruling. The political fallout is also significant because Republicans have to explain to their voters why the Supreme Court they built with 3 Trump appointees just struck down one of Trump's signature policies. They have to reconcile their support for strong executive action with a Supreme Court ruling that such action was unconstitutional. And they have to figure out whether to attack the court, which risks undermining judicial legitimacy, or accept the ruling and admit their approach to executive power was flawed. Democrats, meanwhile, will use this ruling to argue that Trump has been exceeding his constitutional authority all along, that his approach to executive power was always problematic, that checks and balances are working to constrain overreach, and they'll push for stronger congressional oversight and more aggressive judicial review of executive actions. That's going to make it harder for Trump to implement policies unilaterally going forward. And here's the thing that should concern anyone who cares about constitutional governance. This case shows how far Trump was willing to push executive authority beyond constitutional limits. If the Supreme Court has to step in and impose $88 billion in sanctions to stop unconstitutional action, that means the president was willing to violate the Constitution in very serious ways, and it raises questions about what other constitutional boundaries Trump might be willing to cross if courts don't actively stop him. So yeah, this Supreme Court ruling is about way more than tariffs. It's about fundamental principles of constitutional government. It's about whether presidents are bound by separation of powers or can act as unilateral decision makers. It's about courts being willing to impose real consequences for constitutional violations. And it's about establishing precedent that will shape presidential power for generations. Okay, so let's break this down into the core pieces you need to understand, because there's a lot happening here and it all connects. Trust me on this. First point, the Supreme Court ruled that presidential emergency powers have constitutional limits that courts will enforce. This is the foundation of the entire decision. Trump claimed broad emergency authority to impose tariffs without congressional approval, but the court said no. That authority is limited by constitutional separation of powers. Presidents can't bypass Congress to remake policy in areas where Congress has primary authority. And here's why that matters. Emergency powers have been expanding for decades. President after president has claimed broader emergency authority, and courts have generally been reluctant to second-guess presidential determinations about what constitutes an emergency. But this Supreme Court said there are limits, that emergency declarations don't give presidents unlimited power, that courts will scrutinize whether actual emergencies exist and whether presidential actions are justified by statutory authority. That's a huge shift. It means future presidents can't just declare emergencies and do whatever they want. They have to show courts that real emergencies exist, that their actions are authorized by statute, that they're not simply bypassing Congress because legislation would be difficult. And if they can't make those showings, courts will strike down their actions, just like the Supreme Court did here. The bipartisan nature of this decision is also critical, because it shows this isn't about partisan politics. Conservative justices who generally favor executive power join liberal justices in finding Trump's tariff authority unconstitutional. That creates very strong precedent. Future challenges to presidential power will cite this case as proof that even conservative courts will enforce constitutional limits when presidents go too far. Second point, the $88 billion refund requirement creates unprecedented financial consequences for constitutional violations. This isn't a symbolic ruling. This is the Supreme Court ordering the largest financial sanction ever imposed on a presidential administration, and that sanction will have real practical effects. The government has to figure out how to refund that money. Businesses have to receive their payments. The federal budget has to absorb the impact. It's going to create administrative chaos and political problems for Trump. And that's the point. The Supreme Court wanted to ensure this ruling has teeth, that it's not just a legal opinion that gets ignored. By imposing such massive financial consequences, they made compliance mandatory. Trump can't just refuse to follow the ruling without facing political disaster. He has to refund the money, even though it undermines his economic agenda and his political narrative about strong leadership. The budget impact is particularly problematic because $88 billion is a massive amount of money that wasn't planned for. The administration will have to find that money somewhere, either through spending cuts, which will anger constituencies who lose funding, or through increased borrowing, which will worsen the deficit, or through new revenue, which means tax increases or other unpopular measures. There's no good option. Every choice creates political problems. And think about what this means for presidential accountability going forward. If the Supreme Court is willing to impose $88 billion in sanctions for constitutional violations, that establishes that courts can hit administrations with serious financial consequences. Future presidents will have to consider whether their unilateral actions might result in massive refund requirements if courts rule against them. That's a real constraint on presidential behavior that didn't exist before. Third point, the precedent this ruling establishes will affect presidential power across all policy areas. The Supreme Court's reasoning isn't limited to tariffs. It applies to any situation where presidents try to use emergency powers or executive authority to bypass Congress. Immigration restrictions based on emergency declarations, military deployments justified by statutory interpretations, regulatory changes implemented through executive action, all of it is now subject to closer judicial scrutiny based on this precedent. And you know what? That's going to change how presidents operate. They can't just act unilaterally and hope courts defer to executive authority. They have to ensure they have clear statutory authorization. They have to work with Congress to get proper legal foundations for major policy initiatives. They have to respect constitutional limits on executive power. And if they don't, courts will strike down their actions and potentially impose serious financial or administrative consequences. The implications for Trump's other policies are particularly significant. Because he's used similar emergency authority and expansive interpretations of executive power for immigration restrictions, funding reallocations, and various other initiatives, and now all of those policies are vulnerable to challenge based on this Supreme Court precedent. Lower courts will look at this ruling and apply the same constitutional reasoning to other cases. And many of Trump's unilateral actions might get struck down as a result. The warning about dangerous precedent is also important, because the Supreme Court is explicitly saying that allowing unchecked presidential emergency powers would threaten constitutional governance, that future presidents could exploit those precedents to accumulate more and more power, that the only way to prevent that is to enforce limits. Now, that's the court thinking institutionally about protecting the constitutional system rather than just deciding one case. Fourth point, the political implications are massive for both Trump and the Republican Party. This ruling undermines Trump's image as a strong leader who gets things done. It shows that his signature economic policies were unconstitutional. It forces him to refund massive amounts of money, and it establishes that even the Supreme Court he helped create won't support him when he violates constitutional limits. For Republicans generally, this creates a real dilemma. Do they defend Trump and attack the Supreme Court, which risks undermining judicial legitimacy and their own judges? Or do they accept the ruling and admit Trump exceeded his authority, which undermines their narrative about strong executive leadership? There's no good answer politically. Either choice creates problems with different parts of the base and different political constituencies. So yeah, what happens next? Trump has to implement the refunds. The administration has to figure out how to absorb the budget impact. Other policies based on similar claims of emergency authority face renewed legal challenges, and the Republican Party has to grapple with a Supreme Court ruling that fundamentally rejects their approach to executive power. My prediction? This decision will reshape how presidents operate for decades, because the Supreme Court has established that there are real limits to emergency powers and executive authority, that courts will enforce those limits, and that violations can result in massive financial and political consequences. Future presidents will be more cautious about claiming unilateral authority. They'll work harder to get proper congressional authorization. They'll be more careful about how they justify their actions. But in the short term, this is devastating for Trump. His signature policy struck down as unconstitutional, massive financial sanctions, a Supreme Court that includes his own appointees ruling against him. That's not something you can easily spin as a victory or dismiss as partisan bias. That's the highest legal authority in America saying you violated the Constitution. And look, I know some people will say this is judicial activism or courts overstepping their role, but the Supreme Court's job is to enforce constitutional limits on government power. That's literally what judicial review means. And when a president claims authority that exceeds constitutional bounds, courts are supposed to stop them. That's how the system is designed to work. So here's the bottom line. This Supreme Court ruling matters enormously. It matters because it establishes firm limits on presidential emergency powers. It matters because it imposes unprecedented financial sanctions for constitutional violations. It matters because it applies across all policy areas where presidents try to act unilaterally. And it matters because it shows that even a conservative Supreme Court will enforce constitutional constraints when presidents go too far. We're watching the constitutional system of checks and balances actually work. The judicial branch checking executive overreach, enforcing separation of powers, protecting congressional authority, and establishing precedents that will shape governance for generations. Whether you think that's a good thing or a threat to effective leadership depends on your views about presidential power. But there's no denying this is a historic ruling that changes everything about how presidents can use executive authority. Stay tuned. The fallout from this decision is just beginning.